Let me welcome you tonight. We're sorry we were late starting, but they got tangled up with some press folks doing interviews. But this is to welcome you to Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government, and in particular to a panel on tales of campaigns past. As this presidential campaign season is coming to a close, the pundits are already pontificating on how this campaign has been done badly or well, or how it differs from past campaigns. Some people see it as the most boring, least issue-laden, and uninspiring in living memory. Others see it as a replay of 84 or 80, or as one wag has said, a rerun of 76 with a Republican who lacks Gerald Ford's pizzazz, and a Democrat minus Jimmy Carter's humor. To tell us just how similar this campaign, or different, is from recent campaigns, we've got some folks who know what happened in prior campaigns, from Carter Mondale to Reagan Bush. To moderate the evening's panel, we're pleased to have Chris Matthews, author of the recent best-selling book, Hardball: How Politics is Played, Told by One Who Knows the Game. That's the title. Okay? Yes. Chris has been, one of his friends has commented, sort of half Huck Finn, half Machiavelli. And the recent New York Times review says about the book that it's a modern version of The Prince. Therefore, to introduce the panel and to make sure that the people stay on subject, Chris Matthews.
I want to say at the outset that tonight's proceedings will be nonpartisan and non-substantive in spirit with the 88 campaign. I just want to introduce everybody up front so nobody will get antsy. Les Francis from the Carter administration, who I knew very well. He worked in all the Carter campaigns, the winning and the losing, and also the Mondale campaign. Kathy Bushkin, who brought to us that axe-throwing senator from Colorado, Gary Hart, remember him? Kathy was his press secretary, and actually brought him to national prominence. To my immediate right, and sort of the center right of the stage, is David Gergen of the U.S. News and World Report, who was as much responsible for Ronald Reagan's legislative victories as anyone, because he sort of performed the foreplay in terms of the national media. That's an old sexual term. Dick Mastrangelo.
Went out in the 80s, huh?
Yes. Dick Mastrangelo is a person from this area who was played a major role in the Jerry Ford campaign, both the successful first half and the unsuccessful last half. And Ed Rollins, who is really, I think, as much as anyone in the country, personifies the brilliant efforts by the Republicans to reach out and pick up those 11 million Americans we hear all about all the time, Reagan Democrats. He should have been Secretary of Labor, but he wasn't married to John McLaughlin. And I don't think he could correct that either. I want to say something about this campaign right up there. I want to do a 2-minute capsule, then everybody else is going to talk more than me. It seems to me that this campaign has been rough. It's been raw. It hasn't been substantive, if you mean by substantive, the kinds of issues Congress fights with the president about. Those kinds of issues. I think it's fair to say that Alice Roosevelt Longworth captured it all when she said once, if you don't have something good to say about someone, come sit next to me. Or as a senior citizen once said in the Goldwater campaign, one of the dirtiest campaigns ever, the one launched against him in 1964, she said, I'm not voting for that man, Barry Goldwater, because he's going to take away my TV. And the commentator, the pundit, said, ma'am, I think you've got it wrong. He wants to eliminate TVA. And she said, I'm not taking any chances. Which I think is where there's smoke, there's fire, and that's why negative works, to be honest about it. Now, I just want to do a 2-minute capsule of this campaign, then everybody else starts. In July, the Democrats had poll data from William Hamilton and other people that said that the number one issue that people mentioned, black and white, women and men, north and south, for voting for Michael Dukakis was George Bush. It was simple. This was a simple campaign to win. The number two reason they gave the pollsters, this was 28%, the first answer was 33%. The 28% was they wanted some kind of change in direction for the country. Now this could include liberals who wanted to move away from conservatism, the 8-year itch, the antsiness. It can be people out of work who wanted a job. It can be people, all kinds of reasons. What did the Democrats do with this information? They spent a week Bush bashing. Remember? They bashed him on two particular regards. One, that he was kind of inarticulate. and the other that he was an elitist, a man born to old money and still living somewhere off in old money land, somewhere in Kennebunkport, but not really part of our scene. And they used that for a week. The jokes began the first night with the first line, which was, he was a man born with a silver foot in his mouth, which captured both negatives in one line. He was both inarticulate and well-born, both negatives. He was also a toothache of a man, according to Jim Hightower of Texas. This went on through Teddy Kennedy's Where Was George to Tony Quella's very imaginative Where Was George Bush. This went on all week. What did the Democrats accomplish? They left happy. They liked each other. They had no mission except the obvious, which was to pick up the pieces. Republicans, luckily for them, had the same poll data, and they made better use of it. They met in New Orleans, a much more interesting city than Atlanta, I must say. And what did they decide to do? The first thing they would do was that they would fix the personality of George Bush through some wonderful work by people like Roger Ailes and probably the greatest speechwriter living today, Margaret Noonan, who wrote that magical 2 minutes where George Bush said, yes, I tend to be ineloquent. Yes, I tend to be awkward. I'm a quiet man. This is the greatest spin I've ever seen. I'm a quiet man, therefore I can hear the quiet people. It was magnificent. I had tears in my eyes. I'm sure David did. I'm sure Ed did. We all did. It was magnificent. In one stroke, this man became Ozzie Nelson, Jimmy Stewart, our guy, no longer the elitist from Kennebunkport. He was now running against the elitist from here. All right? Magical stuff. The second thing they did was they became the party of change. They'd read the poll numbers. They knew the 8-year itch was effective in American history, and they were going to deal with it. So what did they do? Ronald Reagan came to town for one reason. He came to say, we are the change. That was the only thing he said. And he left. Wasn't the greatest speech he ever gave. Ken Kashigian wrote it. All it did was accomplish a purpose, which was to set the agenda for the week. We're not yesterday's news. We're the change. Carter is status quo. Very smart politics. Then they went into then they explored the perils of computer dating. And they picked the vice president. They went into they fed into the machine 3 parameters: youth, looks, Midwest, the 4th parameter, movement conservative, okay by Gordon Humphrey. Out popped Dan Quayle. They didn't pump in college board scores, IQ, other parameters. Didn't matter. You know why? Because it doesn't matter to most people, believe it or not. And so they became the party of change. Count the number of words that you heard along the lines of change, youth, future in the Republican campaign convention. It was enormous. It went on and on and on, and they really did accomplish that, so much so that their most recent poll said that half the people who want change in this country are for Bush. That was the Times Mirror poll. A dramatic piece of work. So here we are today, and then they began that was the good and the bad of the campaign. The good being the flowering of George Bush's personality, the emergence of the butterfly from the caterpillar. The second was the computer date, which brought us Dan Quayle, and now the ugly positioning. Not since the days of Murray Chotiner in 1946 in Orange County have we seen a more effective pasting of a guy as a left-winger. It's been brilliant. It's been based on the best state-of-the-art polling and focus groups. They have found that what is a liberal in 1988 is not a guy who spends too much money, certainly not a man who runs big deficits. That's not a liberal. A liberal is a guy who coddles criminals and who coddles the left, the communists, a man who's weak on defense, a man who is with the ACLU, who's for the furlough, that sort of person. So they basically found a brilliant way to identify Michael Dukakis as a man who doesn't want to give the Pledge of Allegiance. It's a good piece of work. They have positioned him as a lefty. He ran as a technocrat. He said this campaign's not about ideology, it's about competence. They said, rightly so, yes it is, because they're right on this one. The presidency of the United States is uniquely a philosophical institution. And the idea that you can run as a manager is missing something. And so here we are today with an election that looks like a tough one for the Democrats, a good one for the Republicans, and we're 2 weeks out. And we're going to talk about tonight with some of the really good people from the last several campaigns. And what I think we really want to do as students of this process is try to figure out what's changed. Is it any worse than it was, or does it just seem worse? Is it any tougher than it was? Is it any more media-oriented, more personality-oriented? Or is it basically something that we've seen before in a different form? Now, I want to open it up with the tough stuff because I want to keep your interest. And one thing I want to open up with is, like all Americans, is the negative. And I want to ask some of the people here who are with me on the stage to begin thinking, as I begin thinking about my question, what is it true that this campaign is essentially a departing point, something new and nasty about American politics? Or is it in fact consistent with good old apple pie negative politics? And I want to begin, does anybody want to take on that first? David?
Well, I think that
history will certainly record this as not the nastiest campaign. It's certainly one of the nastiest we can remember in the last 20 years or so. But I think if you go back in the 19th century and look at a variety of campaigns, then you'll find they were much tougher. The language, the rhetoric was much more strident than it is now. They call people much tougher names. They accuse each other of adultery, of getting people pregnant, one thing and another. I think that if you're, and we've had rumors of that in this campaign, but they haven't really been printed in too many family magazines. But I think the fact is that in almost every campaign that I can remember in the last 20 years, a lot of people have wound up at the end of it and said, "Is this the best we can do?" And they're dispirited, and I find particularly that's been true about young people in the last several campaigns. And so I don't think there's anything terribly new about in that respect. But I do believe that both candidates, but I think it may have started with the Democrats, but it certainly got tougher and worse under the Republicans, have stretched the truth, have engaged in a lot of deceptions, and in particular have ducked the issues, so that none of us has a clear idea about what the priorities will be of the next administration.
Les Francis from the Carter and Mondale campaigns.
I agree with David's final point. I would disagree only with this point. There may have been nastier campaigns in the 19th century. I'm sure that's true. But the impact of television has magnified these negative campaigns tremendously. And I think that there is a very good chance that following this election that there will be a spirited debate among politicians and journalists and others about the course of this campaign, the way it developed, the use of negatives, and perhaps it will produce a healthy reexamination of this particular kind of negative campaign.
Of course, we can't blame Dan Quayle for anything that happened in this campaign because, as he said himself on the record, I didn't live in this century. Kathy Bushkin.
I think one of the ironic things about the negativism in this campaign is that to some degree, if Dukakis had fought back, people would be happier. One thing that makes people so dispirited at the end of this campaign is the sense that these charges have landed and nothing has come back. If you believe in some of the things Dukakis believes in, you feel your whole position has been underrepresented in this campaign. And I think that's why the negatives grate on us and make us feel that the whole thing has been more degrading, where in fact if he had had a way to defend liberalism, redefine it, state it for what it is worth, explain what the mainstream is, explain his crime program for one thing, I don't think we'd all feel as frustrated by the negativism. It's when the charges land and seem to take hold and seem to find root, and I think people for some reason felt they even took root. There was something about Dukakis that people were nervous about that made him work.
Is it an A issue? Is the furlough program in Massachusetts an appropriate focus for the last 2 weeks of a presidential campaign?
It's not, but for some reason it's become the code word for other things that worry people, and for the reason that Dukakis hasn't addressed those, it's become the issue people are debating.
Would anyone like to challenge? Does anyone think it is not an appropriate thing to be talking about in this campaign? Does everybody think it's fair game? Is this a fair game media discussion that's been going on the last several weeks? I would say it may be topic A, Willie Horton. I think he's become, thanks to this campaign, the second most famous black name in American politics. And it's a dramatic development. As Lee Atwater said, I intend to make him a household word by Election Day, and I think he succeeded.
The interesting thing, I sat in a strategy breakfast months ago when Lee Atwater said that, and Len Nofziger turned and he said, "Yeah, Lee," he said, "Willie Horton, everybody will know who Willie Horton is. He plays first base for the Detroit Tigers." Well, the bottom line is that...
Only on weekends.
Only on weekends. The bottom line in this particular campaign...
You try getting a guy a date when he's home on the weekend.
The bottom line in this campaign is obviously there have been more negative campaigns in American politics, but never before the American audience, national audience. This is not like any other presidential campaigns, but it's very much like the 1984 Jim Hunt, Jesse Helms race in North Carolina, in which you took a very popular governor against a very controversial senator whose only chance of winning was to absolutely destroy that governor. In the course of one solid year, he had absolutely destroyed that governor, and he won 51-49. Drove Hunt's negatives up in the whole shoot match. Everybody said that will never work in a presidential campaign. When Atwater and others first started talking about doing this kind of a campaign, because Bush had incredibly high negatives early on, people who had been around this business said it'll never work. The assumption why it would never work is they always assumed somewhere along the line Dukakis would respond. You talked about the quiet man. I'm sort of reminded in this campaign, the quiet man, of another figure you didn't mention who played the original quiet man, John Wayne. This is sort of John Wayne versus the nerd in the schoolyard. I mean, you're sort of to a point where, you know, maybe you got a right to punch his lights out, but it's kind of gone too far. You sort of expected somewhere along the line for Dukakis to define himself. And what happened in this campaign is Mike Dukakis, who obviously has been an effective governor up here, went through a 2-year process, and it's a terrible process that we put our candidates through. I mean, you go spend 100 days in Iowa or 70 or 80 days in New Hampshire, you don't have a summer home up there. It's pretty tough politics, and that's what we put our candidates through today. You assume when you've been on the trail for 2 years that everybody knows what you've been talking about, that everybody's as focused on the campaigns as you are, because you're surrounded with press, you're surrounded with political people, and you're surrounded by political junkies who are all saying, good point, this is great, you're doing a wonderful job. By the time Mike Dukakis got to the campaign, or to the convention, he thought his lead really indicated that the American public had made a choice. They didn't like George Bush and they liked him. And what the American public had made a decision on is they didn't like George Bush. George Bush was a man who, for a variety of reasons, had incredibly high negatives, I don't think justifiable negatives, and not hard negatives. Normally negatives come about by polarizing figures. A Jesse Jackson, a Barry Goldwater, who divide audiences by very strong positions. George Bush didn't divide audiences, so his numbers were somewhat phony. Dukakis thought he was defined, thought he had defined himself in the course of the campaign. Competency was going to be the issue. The bottom line is he wasn't defined. The American public, the night he got nominated, had a real thirst for some knowledge about, well, who is this guy? What is Mike Dukakis all about? He went on cruise control for 6 weeks, and he let George Bush go out and define him effectively. I've said over and over again, and I happen to be a big George Bush fan, that if Mario Cuomo or if another candidate would have had the Democratic nomination and you would have tried to put that stuff on him on the flag, you'd have had the flag and the pole down your throat, and that would have been the end of the campaign. Negatives only work when you don't respond to them. It's like football. If you're going to let someone roll up the score on you, you're not going to catch up. You got to respond. Now, that doesn't mean you got to go out and respond on the issue that's your own negatives. Negatives reinforce negative impressions people have. It didn't do Mike Dukakis any good to go out and say, that's not fair on Willie Horton. I mean, George Bush was aware of this one, and Ronald Reagan, he furloughed guys when he was governor of California. Well, you're never going to convince the American public that George Bush or Ronald Reagan is soft on crime, so you basically move to another issue. You basically say that's a falsehood, that's untrue, and let's talk about all the corruption in the Reagan administration. We really want to talk about people getting furloughs. You've got to divert it to your strengths and not fight on. And he has fought this entire campaign on Bush's high ground, and Bush is killing him.
Anybody have anything to add to that? Does everyone believe? Dick, go ahead.
The first dirty campaign was the first Washington administration in which, Alexander Hamilton did everything he could to keep John Adams from being vice president. I think that was the first one. The dirtiest campaign probably was the election of 1900, in which Adams and Jefferson went at it. Dirty campaigns, to me, mean something different. When I'm talking about you, I'm talking about your record. When you're talking about me, you're playing dirty. Whom I blame for the problems of the 1988 election are the American people. They've put up with it. They've allowed it to happen. They have continued to watch the news bites. They haven't said we're fed up. The polls haven't shown that there have been more and more and more undecided. They've shown that the undecided has been getting narrower and narrower and narrower. They're willing to put up with it. They deserve the campaign they get.
Well, does everyone agree that Michael Dukakis could have offered a more formidable defense of himself on the furlough and these other social issues? I guess everyone agrees to that. Does everyone agree that it was a fair charge to begin with? Does anyone want to question that the furlough program in particular, or the Pledge of Allegiance question in the 77 legislation, was in fact out of bounds? Or is everything in bounds? Everything is in bounds, David?
I want to defend the public in this thing. There are several things I don't like about the way we as citizens respond to candidates, in particular that we're not willing to let anybody speak courageously about some of the issues we should be talking about, like taxes and Social Security and the other problems we have in our deficits, and the people like Walter Mondale, whom I disagree with very much philosophically, but I think he had the courage to stand up for what he believed in 84, and he got clobbered for it. And I do think that we have shortcomings as citizens in not allowing candid discussion about our country's future. But I want to speak to somebody else about the campaign and the interpretation of the campaign, which is starting to heavily creep into the interpretation in the press. And that is that somehow this citizenry is racist, that Bush is appealing to the racism in America, and that's what's turning people on, that somehow by talking about furloughs or talking about the Pledge of Allegiance, he's talking about he's debasing us, and we, the public, are responding to that in some sort of low-quality way. I have to tell you, I think that's a misunderstanding of the way people are in this country. That I think when Bush talks about the Pledge of Allegiance and about crime and those issues, he's speaking to people about where they live and the kind of society they want to live in, and the way they want that society ordered. And I think to sort of simply dismiss that as being the the Bubbas of the South, that this is what they were somehow responding to the racial issue. I don't think Willie Horton had much to do in its initial stages with race. It clearly was an offensive issue, especially to many blacks. But I think a lot of whites have responded to the Bush campaign not because they see it as it's appealing to their racist instincts or their base instincts. I think we ought to give more credit to people about the concerns they have as citizens about some of the ways that they live and the traditional values that they believe in. They think the country's been stripped of some of those traditional values. They think the elite has taken some of them away from them in one fashion or another. And I think when we in the elite, in effect, look down our noses at them, I think we totally misunderstand who they are and what they believe in.
Anyone disagree with that?
I want to say, I think that touches on what I have found to be one of the most interesting things about the campaign, and that is that both campaigns went after the middle class and did it totally differently. And it's been interesting what has worked. I think the Dukakis people early on identified the middle class squeeze. They had poll numbers that showed high cost of living, the cost of sending your kids to school. All of those things were eating away at middle class Americans and were adding to their uncertainty and fear about the future, and that would be what propelled Democrats into the White House after Republicans. The Republicans took a very different approach to the middle class, which was to go back to some fairly bedrock values that you can say have been with us as contentious values since the 60s. This question of patriotism, family values, sex in the schools, all these social values that to some degree people thought were behind us, but that clearly aren't. And to the degree that the battle for the middle class has been fought over those two things, it's been a very interesting picture of what is moving people and what's making them vote. I don't know that the Dukakis people simply failed to sell their middle class squeeze issues, but clearly the Bush people who identified the values as being middle class issues have succeeded brilliantly on that point.
Ed Rollins?
Kathy, you make some very good points, but what you're really talking about, middle class is a very large segment of the American electorate. When you really get into a presidential campaign, you're talking about a very small group of swing voters, about 18%. You can call them whatever you want, Democrats, Reagan Democrats, swing votables, persuadables. But the truth of the matter is both parties have a base of support in presidential campaigns. The Democrats have about 41, 42%. Mondale was at the base. You see poll numbers today, Dukakis is at the base, 39, 41%. Any Democrat is going to get that 41%. Republicans have a base somewhat similar to that, 41, 42, 43. These are candidates, these are people who vote for either they're partisan Republicans and they always vote for a Republican, or they're partisan Democrats, or they're liberals and they always vote for a Democratic candidate, or they're conservatives who always vote for a conservative candidate. So the 18% that you have out there that you're trying to move are people who aren't partisan. They could care whether they have no pattern to their voting, and they're not conservative or liberals. And they're the voter who makes up their mind at the last moment. And I call them charismatic voters. Democrats call them persuadable. And I call them charismatic because they sit there and they watch their TV and they say, I like that guy. I hate that guy. I like his wife. I like what he stands for. And it's one issue, two issues, one look, one style. And what's happening is Mike Dukakis, and even in his pattern of travel, is running around reinforcing the 41% Democratic base. He's talking to them. I mean, he just made a tour of California, which is less than my home state. He goes to San Francisco, Oakland, Alameda County. That is it. That is the strong part of the Democrat. He doesn't go anywhere near the Valley, doesn't go into L.A. where he's losing, and any Democrat has to win by 250 to 500,000 votes. But and he keeps getting reinforced. People say his crowds are great, people love him. Sure, you're talking to the people that love you. What Bush has done is Bush, from the convention forward, forgot his 41%. He had dealt with them in the convention, and he started going after that swing voter, that persuadable voter. And those are the ones who do those are the ones who, the flag is something sacred to them, and they don't understand the intellectual argument that Mike Dukakis is making. I mean, a guy doesn't like my flag. He's not paying any more attention to the fact that a guy doesn't like my flag. He doesn't hear the second argument. And that's the problem. I don't think Dukakis ever understood the audience he was going after.
I'd like to one of the people who think that's a legitimate issue. What is the real message of the Pledge of Allegiance issue in terms of a negative attack? It is a negative, obviously. What is the real message? It's not constitutional law. It's not an intellectual question. It's something else.
It's right. It's a value thing, and I think the bottom line is, if this was Chuck Robb and his governor of Virginia, who'd been a Vietnam veteran or what have you, he'd veto this bill. There'd been no issue. But the issue was you had Mike Dukakis, who the rest of the country is suspicious of because he comes from Massachusetts, and he's a liberal because he comes from Massachusetts. And I shouldn't say that because it's been one of the best Reagan states. We won it twice in a row, and I was born here. But it's reinforcing a message to a lot of voters out there. And the best answer I heard was Senator McCarthy Eugene McCarthy on Crossfire the other day, and he said, you know what he should have said is, he said, you know the guys that push the flag the most are used car salesmen. Have you ever gone by a used car that they don't have an 80-foot flag, a 100-foot flag, 500 flags on the used cars? You know, and if you'd have responded that way early on instead of saying, constitutionally, this is what the issue was.
Well, does anyone want to challenge this before I do?
No, actually, I would only reinforce two things. One, whether the Willie Horton thing, I happen to think that there is, I don't think for a moment the Bush people sat around and had a strategy session and said, how can we appeal to racists in America? I don't believe that. I don't think George Bush is a racist. I don't think the people in his campaign are. However, I think there's a racial element to that attack and to those ads. I think it has the effect of raising some very ugly sides of the American psyche, and I'm concerned about that. The fact is, as Democrats, we've never understood, and I don't know why this is, that crime is a real issue on the minds of the American people, and that there is nothing illiberal about being against criminals and being tough on criminals. And if we don't understand that, we're going to continue to lose elections. The pledge issue I have a little more trouble with, because I think it leads to some other kinds of ugly possibilities in our society. Not that the flag does, but the question of patriotism and so forth. What we have to learn as a party is how to identify these very important and very legitimate concerns and values of the American people, and then tap into those issues that work on those value structures. And in campaign after campaign, including ones that I've helped run, we've not done that effectively.
Yeah, sure.
One of the things that I think that Ed has said that has to be followed up, and maybe I shouldn't give this advice to Democrats, but I think the important thing here is to note what he said. Ed said that each of the parties has about the same base nationally, give or take a percentage, and that the Democratic campaign this year, and I think in past years, has gone after that base, their base, the base they have, to solidify it, while the Republicans have had to solidify it in order to be nominated, and then can spend their time in the marginal areas where they do have a shot at winning. And for those of you who may remember back when the Republican Party in Massachusetts was hopelessly outnumbered, but was electing governors and lieutenant governors and attorney generals and United States senators, they did it the same way. They used swing vote, switch vote, whatever you want to call it. They identified that part of the population which had a propensity to listen to the arguments of either side and could swing an election. That, it seems to me, is what Michael Dukakis has not been able to do.
I want
to just pick up on and quarrel just a bit with Ed. This point about going to San Francisco and the base. At this point in the campaign, I've not been involved in the strategy discussions in this campaign, nor in the scheduling decisions. But if I were to advise him at this point, I would probably advise a San Francisco hit and an Oakland hit, because at this point, with the numbers, the polls, and the publicity the polls are getting, you've got to show that your campaign still has vitality. And the way you do that is with crowd events. And you show that there's still spirit, enthusiasm, and the possibility of victory. Now, you don't do a schedule that's exclusively those kinds of events, but you have to do a number of them to show the campaign's alive.
Right. I was with Carter in the dog days of October of 1980, and we would go to black churches in Seattle And Seattle was the only place we could draw a crowd. Seattle's great. I saw that Dukakis had 10,000 the other night. I said, yeah, we did too. Seattle is the only left-wing area of the western United States, besides San Francisco, I think.
Doesn't that lead to the question as to whether or not Michael Dukakis has spent too much time in Boston in this campaign? A number of his major events have been televised from Boston. Why Boston?
He's trying to win your vote, Dick.
He's
working at it.
I think he made a mistake coming back to Boston. And please, once again, no offense to Boston. In 1980, we tried to run the Reagan campaign out of Los Angeles. Jimmy Carter ran his campaign out of Atlanta and almost lost it in the final analysis. It was a good primary strategy, but it doesn't work in the general election. There's a lot of criticism of Beltway mentality in Washington, D.C., and what that means is people read the Washington Post and they react to each other. But the truth of the matter is you got 535 people who every weekend go back to their state, go back to their district, and they're politicians. And politicians' basic rule number one is survival. And they go back and people say to them, we love you, Congressman, but that idiot who's heading this ticket, he ought to be saying such and such. And if they come back and they have some input, as anybody in a Washington headquarters knows, any congressman, any senator comes pound on the door and you listen, somebody listens. Up here, it's isolation. He came back here. He's the governor of the state. He's a beloved figure in the state. The Boston Globe obviously has given him favorable press up here. People say you're doing a great job. And there's no litmus test. There's nobody basically saying, friend, you ain't doing well here. And that's what you need. You need reality checks in the course of the campaign.
The Boston Globe is here tonight. I've just seen it.
Can I ask a quick question to a couple people here? And I ask for your opinion. I was with Tom Wicker on a panel earlier this week, and he made the provocative point that in his opinion, if Jesse Jackson had been the nominee of the Democratic Party, he would be closer to George Bush tonight than Michael Dukakis. What do you all think of that?
Well, I don't agree. But I think there's some things that are true to that. There's something about that that's true. People can spot a person who's not confident with their position very quickly. They don't know who's right, but they can tell who's confident, rightly or wrongly. And I scored the debate that way. Fortunately, in two cases, unfortunately, in another. I scored on the basis of who seemed the most sure of what they were saying. And unfortunately, I thought Quayle was most sure of his position one night. But the fact is, I think that Michael Dukakis, on the issue of the pledge, shows himself to feel that he's in a weak position. I don't know how many times you've all seen Man for All Seasons, but there's a great scene at the end of the play. It's about Sir Thomas More when he finally confronts his accusers and tells them the truth. And say, I'm tired of playing games. It's the divorce that caused this case, and let's not kid ourselves. And I'm waiting for Dukakis to come out and say what really was his motivation in vetoing the 77 bill. Why doesn't he tell his friends? An advisory opinion from the Superior Court? Give me a break. If Roosevelt had tried it, there wouldn't have been a New Deal. You don't ask for advisory opinions unless you want one. And the question I have is, why didn't he just come out and say, I believe true Americans, and this is the simplest thing you can say about this country, believe in freedom. It's the simplest thing we have in common. It's not culture, it's not ethnicity, it's not history even. It's only a couple of hundred years of history. The one thing we have in common is freedom and a belief that everybody should make up their own minds about what they want to say. And you can't tell teachers or students or anyone what to say just to simply make you feel good that you can make them say it. Because there's no other, there's no other product to reciting the Pledge of Allegiance except making somebody else feel good you did it. If you feel like saying it, say it. Now, I wondered why he just didn't say it that way. I've been in third world countries overrun by communists, and they make people freeze at sundown every night to pay allegiance to the state. Just freeze into your tracks for 5 minutes, just to show that you love the state and respect the government. That's not Americanism. I don't know why he just didn't say it that way. I've done this in front of business groups, and they agree with me. I mean, you just have to say, I'm a libertarian, I'm an American. On that issue, I just think students even should make up their own minds. I'm sorry. Does that make you a commie? I think he didn't want to say it that way. For some weird reason, he wasn't comfortable with his position. He may have felt he was too much an elitist on the issue. Somebody may have come to him, somebody like us, and said, cool it. You're never going to sell this in Yahoo land. So you better cool it. You'll never sell libertarianism out there. I've been out there once or twice, and they don't like that point of view. But I'll tell you, I think you can sell libertarianism in this country to conservatives faster than you can sell government to them. Right, Ed? I think, in other words, I think we've come to the conclusion here, which is kind of baffling to people who read the newspapers, is that anything is fair. Because you ought to be able to take it. If you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen, as Harry Truman said. If Michael Dukakis can't take a shot on a veto, he shouldn't have vetoed. If he can't take the shot, if you can't stand up for what you do in public life, this isn't something you did in the closet somewhere. If you can't stand up for something in public life, then you shouldn't be in the business. Isn't that a legitimate question?
Yeah. While they're thinking of an answer, let me point out to you that the Massachusetts House of Representatives opens every session with the Pledge of Allegiance.
I think your point of his running away from issues, I mean, it's like liberalism. Mario Cuomo would go out and define liberalism in a whole new way that I'm sure would get a lot of Reagan Democrats to support him. Ronald Reagan, when he ran in 1980, conservatism wasn't, Goldwater conservative wasn't exactly a magic word, and he went out and convinced the American public that it was okay, and that he was okay, and that he wasn't this crazy kook that everybody had tried to depict him to be. And I think what's happened here is you have a candidate who obviously is not very comfortable on the attack. I mean, obviously his last great attack was on Gebhardt. He didn't take too long to respond to Gebhardt, but he just is, I think he wants to deal on a presidential level, on an intellectual plane, and what you do after this 2 years of going out and speaking to small audiences is you got 90 days of full-scale war, and the difference between accusations that have been made in the past in presidential campaigns is you got 100 million people every day paying attention to what's being said, and it's not paying attention to big long speeches, they're reacting to the fight. It's the greatest game going every 4 years. It's like the Olympic sports, and people want to know who's up, who's down. They want to know who said what, who didn't say what. The most memorial line of this will be, "You're not John Kennedy." And it's not going to be big issues. Big issues are what are important to that 41%. And I keep going back to that. It's that swing vote that keeps going back that aren't into the big issues. They're into watching it every night on television, or they're into reading about the first paragraph of the newspaper, and it's just a gut reaction. It's the most personal choice people make. It's not a rational choice in the final analysis. It's a gut choice of who do I want in my living room every night for the next 4 years, and who do I feel confident that's going to lead this country.
Let's talk about that. We've talked about the negative role in campaigning. I think the big question that people talk about this year in terms of running a national presidential campaign is, what is the role of issues vis-a-vis personality politics? I want you to think about this for a minute. Have we reached the point where the question you've just posed is the most important question, who, not what? We've had a number of forces that have worked in this campaign. The world condition has improved for whatever reason, exogenous factors probably, but it has moved in a positive direction. The Soviet Union certainly seems to be more reasonable at the diplomatic level, if not at the gun-producing level. They're still producing the missiles, but they're talking nicer. The economy is at 5.4. That's a good barometer. The misery index is down. You can talk about trade, and you can talk about the fiscal problems overall, but the symptomatic problems seem to be in pretty good shape. But the two personalities running for president, we thought in the beginning, I thought, were big question marks. How well would the wimp factor play? How well would Michael Dukakis play as he was introduced to the country at large? That, to me, those questions seem to be more and more in the domain of the campaign. How do you present your candidate? I mentioned how George Bush was presented very effectively in New Orleans. How has Michael Dukakis been portrayed? And are we moving into an area now where, other things being equal, in other words, the economy's in pretty good shape, the 8-year itch is there, but it's not that strong. They seem to outweigh each other. Or do they outweigh each other? Or are the forces more important than the personalities in this campaign? And are we not seeing an illusion here that George Bush is more regular a guy than we thought it was, and that being significant? Does anybody want to venture a proposition as to, are we moving more towards the age of personality politics and away from issue-oriented, party-oriented, maybe British-style elections where you vote for a philosophy and sort of put up with the personality?
No.
No.
We're not moving away from it. We're staying where we've always been. How many people in here, how many people on this panel have heard people say, I vote the man, not the party? And yet, when you're electing President of the United States, you are electing a party. You're electing a philosophy. You're electing a cabinet. You're electing a way of conducting the government for 4 years. And yet people will say to themselves, well, forget it. I vote the man, not the party.
Kathy? The only issue I would make with that is the man becomes the, I'm sorry, Kathy. The man becomes the party. The Republican Party of America today is Ronald Reagan. When you ask young people who are now registering as Republicans, you say to them, why are you a Republican? They say, because I like Ronald Reagan. I'm for what he's for. And what the Democrats have been missing is they've not had a strong, articulate national leader defining what it is that they're all about. I mean, if I could basically bottle and sell and put on the road Bob Byrd and Jim Wright, I could elect candidates from one end of this country to the other. I mean, they are fantastic to be out there. I mean, they turn people off. Now, my greatest fear is the Democrats are going to come up with someone...
That's because you're a big city guy.
I'm a big city guy,
that's the
right.
difference.
You know, if the Democrats get someone, and obviously when you have the exposure, and I think what's happened in this campaign, and I'll shut up, is in the course of the 90-day campaign, not the 2-year long cycle, but the 90-day campaign, when it comes down to two folks, and that camera's in your face every night, you get an image of this person. And obviously issues count and lots of things count, but That personality counts for this reason. You watch the reaction, you watch a whole variety of things, and as everybody has said about George Bush, everybody who knew George Bush, is that in private he is a warm, personable man. And that anybody that heard this wimp stuff and what have you said, that's all a public persona. If you could only get to see George Bush the man. Well, people have gotten to see George Bush and all the handlers and all the rest of it is irrelevant. You've got to see George Bush the man. There's not anybody that knows Mike Dukakis, with the possible exception of his mother and Kitty, who's ever said he's a warm, charming man. People have said he's cold, he's effective, he's competent, but they've never said he's a warm, lovable guy who I really want to go on a 2-day weekend fishing trip with. And the bottom line, I think, is the American public's got a very close view of the two men.
Speaking of personality politics, Kathy Bush can work with Gary.
The C word. There was, I think, an overemphasis on character early on in this campaign. They got a little out of control because people...
That was character, the C word.
C word. People reacting to that. I don't think you can have the who without the what, and you can't have the what without the who. And I think Democrats too often shy away from showing who they are and focus on programs. And I think that's been one of Dukakis' problems. The what, Gary Hart had the same problem. They want to focus on the program I'm going to present for this, the program I'm going to present for that, and they don't want to show who they are, how they're going to think about an issue, which is what I think most people in the end want to vote on. Somebody who can bring the two together, and I don't think either candidate, frankly, brought the two together all that successfully this year. The brilliance of the Bush campaign since July was that they decided to change the persona, and the surprise of the change was so great that suddenly there was a warmth there that you hadn't expected. But you've got to have the two together. The issues, if used properly, really can show people what a candidate is all about. And I think candidates that dismiss that and say the issues aren't important miss the bet.
Now, let me suggest something, that if character and personality aren't important, why is it that Lloyd Bentsen has been probably the single greatest winner of this campaign? His name ID is enormous. His popularity is enormous. He gets no bad press. People would probably prefer him of the four candidates. On the other hand, Dan Quayle, despite my support, has had a very tough time. People who agree with him on all litmus test issues think he's probably, on the best night of his life, a welterweight. How come it matters? It does matter. We've seen it. Les, you had a candidate, Walter Mondale, the Democrats had a candidate, who said at the end of the last campaign, the Democrats better find a guy who can do well on television.
Well, I think obviously television is important, but that sort of begs the real question. I think what you're looking for in a president. I disagree with about 90% of Ronald Reagan's public policy agenda, and I have the dubious distinction of having opposed him in every single one of his campaigns, going back to the campaigns for governor of California, having lost all of those.
11 now.
But the fact is that Ronald Reagan is he is the most effective political leader of my adult lifetime. I disagree with him. I'm sorry he was elected in 1980 for lots of reasons, including the fact that I lost my job. I worked against him in '84, but he was elected because people have a sense that Ronald Reagan has a sense of himself. And I don't know. I've never met Ronald Reagan. I've never spent time with him. But the image of Ronald Reagan is that this is a guy totally comfortable with who he is, where he came from, what he's all about, and that works on television, it works with crowds, it works with members of Congress, it works with others, and that's what makes him an effective political leader.
Okay.
I want to take issue with the thrust of this discussion, and that is it's all personality, or mostly personality. And we've had a lot of personality discussion in this campaign, not only because of some of the indiscretions of the candidates, but because there have been no issue discussions. But I'll have to tell you, I think it's performance and office and the condition of the country that ultimately makes the decisive factor in whether an end party is reelected. Ronald Reagan won the election of 1984 and 1983 when the economy started climbing back. And I think Ed will tell you that. Now, the margin of that victory, I think, was greatly magnified by personality and by the good efforts of Ed and others. But I think that the driving force was the comeback of the economy. And I think if you look at this election, I think we in the press have misinterpreted this election to a degree. There have been some things happening at the underlying level which have made an enormous difference. And if you use some of the standard measurements, for instance, of Ed Tufte at Princeton, who says you've got to look at the popularity of the incumbent and the income and the pocketbook level of the voters, and you can have a pretty good gauge of how an election is going to come out. And by that gauge, the election is coming out about the way it normally does. on those factors. I mean, I do not think you can underemphasize how important Reagan has been to Bush. Reagan has given Bush terrific field position. I would say he gave him the ball on about the 20-yard line, maybe the 30-yard line, and Bush carried it over. But Reagan carried it down there for him. Now, Bush's popularity is tied to Reagan's. And a year and a half ago, Reagan was in the doldrums after Iran-Contra and then the crash of the stock market. But he's climbed back up. Reagan in his own polls now, Reagan in the Gallup poll is 60% popularity. He's higher right now than Dwight Eisenhower was at this point in 1960. And that's pulled George Bush right up with him. The condition of the economy, people are less anxious today about the economy than they were a year ago after the stock market. And that's helped a great deal. Let me give you one barometer of that. Ordinarily, the Republican Party does pretty well as the party of peace, but the Democrats run away with the issue of who's best for the economy. George Gallup regularly asks this question, which party is better for the economy? From 1951 to 1981, he asked that question steadily, and the Democratic Party won on that question on every poll from 1951 to 1981. For 30 years, they were the party of prosperity. Reagan started changing that equation, and it bounced back and forth during the 80s. Early this year, in May, the parties were tied on that question, which one is better at bringing prosperity? Since May, with the resurgence that's come in the Middle West, with other underlying economic conditions improving, with inflation being down, the Republicans have opened up an 18-point lead, the biggest one they've ever had, on the question of which party is better able to bring prosperity. And I would argue that those underlying conditions, as much as the personality of the candidates have been important, that those underlying conditions have given George Bush an enormous advantage in the campaign, one that I think any Democrat would have a hard time overcoming. I think Dukakis has done a particularly poor job of trying to overcome it, but I think he was facing a tougher uphill fight than we sometimes admit. On a scale of, let me just suggest one thing, that the forces at work in this general election campaign were at work in July, and yet the forces of peace and prosperity, but yet we found a 17-point discrepancy the other way around from what we find today. So clearly, while the forces were holding constant to some extent, Reagan's popularity has gone up, public confidence in the economy has gone up a bit, but basically those major sweeping forces have been pretty healthy all year. And the question you have to ask is that why has there been this dramatic one-third of the country basically changing its mind, or one-third of the country going from 17 plus for Dukakis to 17 minus for Dukakis? Something besides forces is at work here. I think we have to account for the role of the effectiveness of the campaigns in presenting the personalities of the candidates, or the candidates' performances. I think everyone would agree here that George Bush has done a great campaign. 17-point lead was illusory.
I want to ask a sub-question of that. I wonder how much of it is that we have nominated a governor who has no experience outside of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, basically, and therefore hasn't had the opportunity that a congressman has, or a senator has, or a cabinet officer has, of dealing with national and global issues. Every issue he has to deal with is a local issue. It may be the same as you have in New Hampshire or in Vermont or in Connecticut or even California, but you approach the solution from a more local, state base. Now you're thrust into a national arena and an international arena because you're about to become, if you win, the leader of the free world, and you're in a position where you have absolutely no point of reference except what you're getting from your advisors. You have no internal thermostat, no internal, barometer of how you should play some of these issues and how they will play in Peoria or Des Moines or Sioux Falls or any place else. I think there's a lot of that right here in this campaign. I think also that the governor is at a disadvantage because he doesn't have the congressmen and senators coming in and giving him that if he's not going to be here. Why is this true in this race and perhaps not in 1980? I'm one of the few people who does not believe that the pardon of Richard Nixon cost Gerald Ford the election. I believe the freeing of the Poles in his foreign policy debate did it, because if you look and see what happened in areas that he was expected to carry where there are a lot of Eastern Europeans, his vote was off, and if that vote had not been off, he would have been elected narrowly president.
Right. I heard, by the way, an interesting... Two of the gentlemen here could probably answer the question. There was a reference made just now to Jerry Ford losing the election in 1976 because he said that Poland is not under Soviet hegemony, as he put it. Well, hegemony. The point is that I understand that Jerry Ford was a tremendous memorizer. He memorized brilliantly. His budgetary numbers were, his preparation for budgetary briefings were awesome. And on one of the preparatory briefing books he was given, one that wasn't taken from the other side, Republicans do that, it had said the people of Poland see themselves as not under Soviet hegemony, and he had memorized 3/4 of it and stuck to his guns when the reporter gave him a chance to pull out of it, and he stuck to his guns. Does anyone have a theory as to why Ford thought Poland was free?
I don't think he did think Poland was free. I think he did, in fact, think that the people of Poland were free spirits.
Yeah, let me just say
That's right.
I agree. I helped to prepare President Ford for both of his debates, or three of his debates, in '76. And I'll tell you, it's not that he's a great memorizer, Chris. He knew the budget issues backwards and forwards because he worked in the Congress for 25 years, and that's the reason we recommended that he go out and give that briefing, because he was the first one since Harry Truman to do that. And he didn't get a lot to prepare for. He beat him in that first debate, and that was a great surprise to a lot of people, Ford beating Carter. On the second debate, I think that this illustrates some of the perils of campaigning, by the way, and a campaign, and how much of a problem you can have with a candidate. The real problem that Ford was having in that second debate went to the question of, he was worried that if he said Poland was under Eastern domination, he in effect would be conceding Poland and Eastern Europe to the Soviets. And he was terribly worried about doing that. Some of you may recall the debate about the Sonnenfeld Doctrine in the mid-'60s and what that all revolved around. And it was very much that kind of issue. And Ford, afterwards, and this is where the real problem came, our problem was not just what he said, but the fact that we couldn't clean it up. We couldn't, this was pre-Spin Patrol days. And we went to the candidate afterwards and said, Mr. President, you made a mistake, and we got to go out and you got to concede you made a mistake. And he didn't believe he'd made a mistake, and he refused to concede it. And we couldn't. And Carter went out and started beating him over the head with it very properly. And Ford just went smiling happily along. And what candidates do, they travel in a bubble out there. Ed can talk to this very well. And it's very hard for them to see reality. They don't talk to people the way most folks do. They're out there with a lot of cheering and yelling, and they can say, well, look, I didn't make a mistake. Look at all these people out there cheering for me. And they don't see what's happening on television and everywhere else. And we tried for a week, I think it was 10 days finally, to get him to turn around on that issue, concede he made a mistake. And in the meantime, we were taking a real drubbing. But we sent emissaries out from Washington to see him on the plane. We tried to beat up on him. We did everything we could. Wanted to declare war on Poland, whatever the hell we had to do, just to get that thing moved out. And we never could. We never could for 10 days. And I think that's really where the thing went astray. It was in the aftermath. And since then, people have gotten better at spin.
Does anyone know how effective?
He's gotten better at spin.
He's very good.
What Gergen has done now, Gergen goes out and announces to the press that the president misstated, and the president sits there and watches it, and he goes, "Yeah, I guess I did that."
Well, we saw a good example
very well in the Reagan White House.
We saw a very good example of damage control along these lines in the '88 debates,
right,
with the first debate where the vice president was unclear of his policy regarding punishment for women who have abortions. And the next morning, I thought it was a great piece of damage control. At like 8 o'clock in the morning, I mean, the first thing the reporters heard that morning was the bell going off. Bush is getting corrected here. Well, and it was a great piece of work.
That's Jimmy Baker, and Jimmy Baker went through the '76 debate with Ford, and he knew just what price you pay. And Bob Teeter, who was the pollster, went through that with Ford, and they knew what price you pay if you don't clean it up fast. Let me tell you what happened on that '76 debate. After that '76 debate, in the first polls that night, within an hour after the debate and 2 hours after the debate, the polls show that the public thought that Jerry Ford won the debate by a good, strong margin. And then the reporters started coming out and saying how he blew this thing, and Carter got out there and knocked him in one thing and another, and Ford refused to speak to it, and we couldn't get the spin going. And by the next night, the question of who won the debate had totally reversed. Bob Teeter saw it in his polls hour to hour how much it reversed. And that showed how important it was for Baker to jump on that abortion question right away before that thing started to take hold and really eat away at Bush. I think the experience in that '76 debate transformed the way we deal with a lot of these questions on Spin Patrol.
What is spin? I want to have somebody define terms for a second for the audience here. It's a very diverse audience. What is spin, David? You're the expert.
Spin?
I have a theory with spin.
I'm just a country boy. You go ahead.
My theory, because he waits to deflate. What I would say is, what I think spin is two steps. First of all, you say something true about usually self-deprecating, and it's usually something like, I'm ineloquent. And then people say, yeah, he's been honest with us. He said he's ineloquent. He sure is. He must be telling the truth. Then he says, therefore I can hear the quiet people. Or you say, David Stockman's in big trouble. God, they're being honest. They're having a lunch with him. His trouble is that he betrayed the president. It isn't that he revealed the biggest truth that ever came out of this administration, which is the deficits are going to triple and the whole tax program was to help the rich. It wasn't that. It was he betrayed the old man. But in other words, if you do a two-step, it's a two-step. The first step is hang a lantern on your problem, admit your problem. Reagan, remember, the best spin I ever saw in this state was Ted Kennedy in 1962. He was running against Eddie McCormick. And Eddie McCormick in that famous debate said, if your name was Edward Moore, you wouldn't be in this race. Pretty true, actually. And Teddy came back and said...
of course, Jack's name were Eddie Moore.
Yeah, that's right, Jack Moore. Anyway, so he came back and said nothing. That was the end of the debate. The next morning, they concocted this wonderful fable about going down to the fish pier, wherever that is, and having a conversation where a working guy yelled up, "Are you the guy that never worked a day in his life?" And Teddy says, "Yes." He says, "You haven't missed a thing." This is brilliant spin, because the question wasn't what's wrong with being rich. Nothing's wrong with being rich. The question was, what are your qualifications to be a United States Senator from Massachusetts? But brilliantly, the Kennedys brilliantly spun the question from an admission of lack of preparation for the position, which he didn't have. He certainly become a fine senator, but he didn't have it then. And what's wrong with being rich? The answer to that question is nothing. So they brilliantly spun the question. Spin is so wonderful to watch, and this guy probably hasn't analyzed what he does, but he does it very well, so much so that the New York Times and CBS were a little nervous if he didn't talk to them 5 minutes before deadline. Right there.
I got to tell you a story about spin. In 1976, I was sent to spend the last 8 days of the campaign before the New Hampshire primary up into New Hampshire to take personal control of the campaign for the Washington staff. I asked what the polls showed. They said, "Oh, don't worry about the polls. They're okay. You got to go up in there and everything else." And I said to the then chairman, Bo Calloway, "What do you need to win?" He says, "A win is a win is a win, and if it's by one vote, by God, you've won it," and everything else. And I'm saying to myself, well, that's absurd. A one-vote win isn't a win. And what I didn't know and what they had held from me is the poll showed that if we won by one vote, we would have won the same kind of upset that the poll showed this year that Bush was going to win if he beat Dole, who was ahead by 8 points. And we got up there and we sloshed it away, and it looked like we might squeak out a win, and we won by about 1,500 votes. I remember calling... Yeah, but we won all the delegates but 3. We won all the delegates but 3, and I could tell you a story about that, too, how they got named. We won, to me, delegates were important. But the spin said you had to win the popular vote, and we won it by, it was more than 12. It was 1,200 something. It wasn't 11 something. 1236. Okay, I'll take it. I remember calling my wife and saying, I remember calling my wife and telling her I was going to come down, spend a couple of days, and then come back up to Massachusetts where we hoped to do it. I said, we won narrowly, we did very well in the delegates. I hope it's enough. And then I called the headquarters to say that I wasn't going to miss my plane. And, I thought that I was David having beaten Goliath. I mean, the reception I got, because the spin was, if we had won by one vote, we had won what was needed, and Gerald Ford, for the first time, had won something outside of Grand Rapids.
One of the best examples of spin in '84 was the Super Tuesday race, when Gary Hart was the underdog, barely squeaking through every campaign day, having won New Hampshire as a surprise not only to the public but to his campaign. Going into Super Tuesday without an organization in any state more than a phone in somebody's home, winning 11 of the 13 states in Super Tuesday and coming out looking like the loser. The Mondale people, I don't know if Les had a hand in this, handled this as brilliantly as anything I've ever seen in terms of portraying Mondale as so on the ropes that if he survived, if he got one state, it was a major victory for him and a major setback for Hart. And we failed to understand how fully the networks were buying into this, how fully people were reacting to this meteoric rise by Hart. We failed to do the critical thing I think Dukakis did this year, which was to answer this question of who is Gary Hart. We'd lived in a cocoon with the press for 18 months in which they knew every position by heart. They could recite them, but no one else could, and we failed to remember that. But the most astonishing thing to me was seeing us win 11 of 13 states and come out of Super Tuesday looking as if we had taken.
Does everybody remember that Gary Hart won 11 of 13 in Super Tuesday in 1984? Everybody remembers Mondale pulling a split.
Yeah. Yeah, part of the problem was that half those states were in a time zone that happened after the network signed off and after the Washington Post and the New York Times and the Boston Globe went to bed. But nonetheless, it was a brilliant piece of work. And
there was a couple things working there. One was I think the media wanted to keep the game going. Let's face it, if there's any bias in the media, it's to keep the game going. I don't think it's liberal anymore. It's to keep the game going. And the best thing they did was NBC led that night at 10 o'clock, and at 3 minutes after 10, Bob Beckel, the director of the Mondale campaign, came running in and said, "We won Georgia." Excuse me, Georgia was not on the A list of states that night. Nobody even knew they had a primary the week before that. The fact of the matter is it became the biggest news to us. All the print people were watching NBC that night at 10 o'clock, and they said, my God. And the other thing is, Beckel explained to me how he did one of these Jerry Bruno numbers. He's the great advance man. He got a room about a quarter as big as this, packed people in like sardines, and they were all meal tickets from Washington. They were all Washington lawyers looking for a job in the next administration. They were not campaign managers. There was not even a campaign going on in Washington that night. They totally created the image of a victory party. He got everybody he could ever get in the room. And then he came out, and then the next morning he went in to see Brian Gumbel on the Today Show, and Brian Gumbel said, congratulations. I mean, that was it. They had won. How did he get the congratulations? They lost 11 of 13 states, but because they created this notion that Georgia, he said, Beckel told me he spent all day Monday and Tuesday saying to the people in the media, if we lose Georgia, we're dead. If we lose Georgia, we're dead. If we lose Georgia, we're dead. If we win Georgia, we're alive. It was brilliant. It was a brilliant piece of spin. It wasn't just what's called lowballing, which is kind of like checkers is to chess. Much more subtle than that. When you do a spin job like they did to keep Mondale in the race just long enough to get in the race, really, because he would have been out, and he won the thing, and Kathy's candidate didn't have legs, basically ran out after that, and that was it. And they won. They didn't lose long enough so they could eventually win.
Let me just state perhaps the obvious. I do think it was a brilliant work on the part of the campaign in terms of the spin on that Super Tuesday. But the fact also is true, if we'd lost 13 of 13, it was all over. And so the campaign believed that if we could win a couple, we could stay in, and the candidate believed if we could win a couple, we could stay in, and that was very important to the psychology of that campaign.
And unfortunately, we also believed if we could win a couple, we would stay in, and that was the wrong message to be sending out there.
One of the problems with primaries. Primaries are a game of perceptions, and when you got, you go to a state like Iowa and you spend 100 days and you speak to more reporters than you ever speak to actual voters in the state, and we've always had the traditional problem here with New Hampshire. You get into this psych game, and you get into this where the media really play very much a role. They define the rules, and the campaign managers and the spin masters, as we call them, we try and define the rules. And it's a crazy business, and unfortunately you can spook people out of a race. You can basically destroy a candidacy that might be a very legitimate candidacy. There's just a whole variety of methods of using it, and I think to a certain extent the press are starting to pay less attention to the big things like debates and what have you. I'm not sure they're paying less attention to the little things like caucuses and those type of things.
Yeah, let me make a couple points about this if I could. Much of what we're seeing in this campaign with regard to the press and the advertising and so forth does have deep roots in American politics that go all the way back to the beginning of television. There's a book on the image by Dan Borston that was written 25 years ago, which first started talking about pseudo events and how we created them in our society. He recalls the story of a woman pushing along a baby carriage with her baby, and somebody walks up and says, "My, what a beautiful baby you have there." And she said, "That's nothing. You should see his pictures." And we have increasingly operated at that level, and a variety of administrations and politicians have perfected techniques over the years. I mean, it really goes back to Jim Haggerty in the Eisenhower days, and then to Pierre Salinger in the Kennedy days, of people who learned how to manage the pseudo events and the images and the messages. I first tuned into this in the I happened to work for Richard Nixon in the early 70s. In 1972, I was went to my first convention and was asked to script the Republican convention in 1972. And we not only totally scripted what was on the podium, but we scripted all the sideshows that we're going to present to the media. When we had boring speakers on the podium who were only up there for political reasons, we had to play some political debts, and we created all sorts of things so we could control that message. I think Jimmy Carter in 1976, the high point of his entire campaign came on the New York, the last night of that convention in New York, when he scripted and wrote, and they had a wonderful evening. And I think, as I recall, it was 93 minutes of television without a commercial interruption. That was terrific, and it practically won the election for him. So people have learned how to do that over the years, and what you're seeing in this campaign are a lot of the masters at work people have learned how to do this very well. But the unfortunate fact of the Democratic Party is that most of those masters right now are in the Republican Party, and the Democrats either don't seem to hire them or don't know where they are or ignore the talent they've got. And don't bring them in, and I think that's hurt Dukakis badly in this media game. I think and I think that's something that our Democrats are going to have to learn. The other point I'd like to come back to is Ed's point, and that is I think the press has now really seen and recognized what those techniques are. They don't know what to do about it. There was a story in the Globe this week of saying a couple of people, David Burke at CBS, president of CBS News, saying we know we're being manipulated, we don't know what to do about it. But I think that we can guarantee that in the months to come, the press is going to spend a lot of time trying to figure out, okay, if that's the way the game is going to be played, we're going to cover it differently. And I think a lot of us in the press need to be thinking about that so that we can get to the issues and not simply be, the co-conspirators in these campaigns.
I think one of the things that I'm very suspicious of, and I think everybody should be when is they watch the evening news on any of the networks, and you hear one of the White House correspondents talk about mood. The mood here is upbeat. This campaign's really got it together. You can feel it here. I'm always suspicious because my job as a speechwriter, and David's done this at a higher level, is to basically create a mood. I mean, we used to do it with every candidate I ever worked with, a politician. Would you try to get them in the mood to look like a winner? The staff had a smile. I was once criticized because I had written a speech and Carter was giving it, and I was in the tarmac, and Steve Weissman of the Times came over to me and said, "What's the matter, Chris?" He's a friend of mine, but he was being professional at the time. And I was miserable because I thought Carter had just blown a line that we had been working. A line we had said, don't use, he had used. It was one of the things like the world's coming to an end today, one of those lines. Or this is a choice between peace and war, one of those kinds of things. And Rick Hertzberg, who is here, came up to me and said, "Chris, don't ever show your feelings in this business." So whenever I hear a network correspondent who's really good at his game, I say, this is one thing you're not good at, because the mood is just as much as a press release. Moods are press releases now. They're put out. Moods are emitted professionally. And the only parallel I can find is if you go to Disney World, and no, seriously, if you go to Disney World, this is all serious, you go 6 miles away, there's a separate entrance. That's where the people who work in Disney World enter. And underground, there's 12,000 people that work underground in this sort of false bottom of Disney World, which you don't even know is down there. I'm sure they have their own lingo, they have their own jobs. You know what their primary job is? For you to be happy from the time you go through the gate and leave it that night. Be happy. Don't worry. And I'm telling you, if you think a candidate's staff can have the mood they feel like that day, you're crazy. Defeatism, you used to get shot for in the Italian army, at least in the Hemingway books. I would expect that if you look defeatist on the Dukakis plane right now, you'd probably be in trouble. Whereas if you look defeatist on the Bush campaign, you'd probably be considered a spin doctor. A little subtle joke there. I want to ask, before we go to the audience, we'll start thinking of some questions, because we have 3 microphones, 2 on the ground and 1 up in the air. The big question is, David just alluded to, and I would like to know the profound answer to it. Why are the Democrats at such a loss to create and nurture and feed this tremendous army of professionals, which today seem to be led by James A. Baker III? Probably he's the hero of my book. And literally, the best professional handler in the business. The people on the B team of the Republican Party seem better than the Democratic A team. You disagree? Great.
Totally disagree with that. Democrats have got some first-rate operatives out there. I mean, they're beating our brains in left and right in gubernatorial races and Senate races and what have you. They are the state-of-the-art today in technique. For many, many years, Republican consultants were the state-of-the-arts for the simple reason Democrats had a majority and all they had to do was get their vote out. So they were much better at getting their vote out, organizational grassroots. Then in the 70s, we went through a period where computers, TV, all this sort of stuff came in, and the persuadable voter, the swing voter, in which we always had to reach out to that voter, so we targeted better. We targeted direct mail, we targeted television in the early stages better. Democrats have come back, and since 1980, we have lost every close election. And we used to win every close election. We have lost every close election. Having spent $1 billion at the 3 national committees, we have still lost every close major election for Senate or governor in this country since 1980.
Why don't they bring them into the national campaign?
Well, I think that's the more significant question. When our campaign is over, no matter where you are in the primaries, it's everybody comes together. And whatever your skills are, or whatever it is, you're there. In this particular campaign, the 3 or 4 best media consultants were on opposite sides. Doak and Shrum, David Sawyer, basically Bob Squire, either that or weren't in the campaign. Those are the kind of guys who've been winning. They've been winning Senate races. They're doing good political campaigns. And if you're going to put a consortium together, that's the consortium you put together. You don't go out and go to Madison Avenue and basically bring together a whole bunch of people who have never been in this business. Now, we were able to do it in 1984, and the secret of why we did it in 1984 is I had a candidate whose entire view of the campaign and whose wife's entire view of the campaign were commercials. That was the business they came out of. They didn't like the commercials of 1980, and so my attitude was, obviously, I didn't think commercials were going to win it or lose it. It was Reagan's performance from 1981 forward was what was going to win it or lose it. So we gave them beautiful commercials. Now, I can't show you any evidence, and I did more tracking polling than anybody in the history of this country, of where any commercial, for or against, ever moved 1 point. But they looked nice, made people feel nice, reinforced the message that Reagan had already given.
Made Mrs. Reagan
and
feel
made
good.
Mrs. Reagan feel good, which made me feel good. But in this particular camp, so everybody says, hey, that's the idea. Go out and get this group of Madison Avenue giants and let them put together. And the truth of the matter is you get the people who know how to do the job, and it's a different business, and they needed some of the pros that they had. None of them are in this campaign in the same way as far as managers, people like Les, others who've done this, know how to do it well, should have been bought in.
Can I just respond? I think one reason that the Democratic Party fails to bring its chief activists together is that the party is still very divided. And maybe the Republicans were a lot less divided this year, but all those camps couldn't come together very easily. I don't think the Dukakis people found a way to reach out to bring them together. And I think one thing the party is going to have to go back and do at the end of this election is look beyond its candidate, not just blame its candidate if in fact Dukakis loses, but at what it stands for. I think part of the problem with the Dukakis candidacy has been a failure to stand for a whole lot and have an ideology to be running on. The handlers are only a little bit of what makes a campaign successful. I don't think this campaign ever quite got to stand for something, and Dukakis became the candidate by and large by being the least of all the extremes. Dukakis was too populist, Jackson was too liberal, and we sort of ended up with Dukakis, but not for any positive reason.
I want to pick up on this, and it's not a reflection really on the Dukakis campaign. I think the Democratic Party faces a very serious challenge in the next few years. It's become sort of conventional wisdom that the Democratic Party is nothing but a collection of interest groups. I think that misses the point. In fact, it says something about people who don't understand either the Democratic Party or American politics. In fact, we are all a collection of interest groups. What we are in danger of becoming, or maybe have become and have to fix, is a collection of protest movements. We have become a party of permanent protest and have forgotten that the goal of an election is to win so you can govern, not to have a vehicle to grind your particular acts.
I want to ask this final question. I'd like you to get ready for some questions. It's a pretty profound question, but have we gone away from the age of organization politics? The old politics was grassroots. It was getting your people out. It was getting them energized, rallies. Everything was aimed at energizing your people. Have we moved pretty much full circle to, or have we moved 180 degrees toward media politics, where what matters is what goes on the tube, whether it's paid or free, or is there still a substantial role to be played by field organizers, by state organization people?
I would not, in a presidential campaign, I would spend very little, on conventional field organization, and I come out of field. I mean, that's my background. I think you can still get to voters individually through phones and mail, and you need to do that, and organize them, using the term loosely, in that way. But instead, I would put more and more emphasis on the creation of good events so that you get good local television, because that's still where most people get their news, is local TV coverage.
The problem in my party is we have become a party of consultants, and you don't pay 15% for volunteer organizations. You get a fee for TV buys and direct mail and what have you, and you don't get any buys or fees for volunteers.
What do you mean?
Volunteer efforts are pretty diminished.
Some campaign managers, when you bring them into your Senate races, like David Garth, will hire a local campaign manager whose job it is to make sure the candidate and the campaign don't get any money. He wants all the money for advertising, and he gets a big chunk of it because he wants to control the campaign completely through TV. And that's become, many candidates are being governed by their media managers to a great extent now in terms of the spending.
Yeah. In the 1976 campaign, I was responsible for the field organization in the entire Northeast and the District of Columbia. Some states it works better in than others. in a political campaign for president, particularly in the early stages in which you're trying to establish some kind of a foothold on the beach that will keep you in the race through New Hampshire or Iowa or at least Super Tuesday, I think you do have to pick some states in which you have a field organization and you begin to capitalize on your strength. But that becomes very difficult to do because you've got a limited, finite amount of money to spend in each state, and it does cost something to have the volunteer field organization. You have to give them some materials, you have to give them a little pat on the head, you have to have some meetings for them. It may not cost much, but it may be just enough. But if I were given my druthers, I would rather see us go back to maybe 76 or maybe 72 when field organization did make a difference, because that's when you begin to have people getting to know the candidate or getting to know the issues or the positions a little better because they have to talk about them to their neighbors.
I want to make a clarification. I'm talking about field in the general election. I think field's very important in the primary and caucus process. I'm talking about from convention on.
Before we get serious, does anyone here believe that the vice presidency is an important part of the campaign process today? Do you see evidence that it still matters to any substantial degree who the running mate is, or does it not matter? Are we seeing any evidence this year of its relative significance? I mean, we have bumper stickers that have Bush Quayle on them, as if equal in a way. Is that anachronistic because so much emphasis in terms of the voters' decision-making is focused on the head of the ticket?
I heard a proposal recently that maybe we ought to look at for a constitutional amendment that says we elect a president who then will nominate a vice president to be confirmed by Congress.
Does anyone still believe the vice president
Well, that worked
matters?
pretty well for your candidate, Ford. That's probably why you want that visa.
Rockefeller didn't do too bad either.
Well, there's a school of thought that thinks George Bush doesn't think it matters.
Anybody?
But what's important is that vice presidents have done very well in the last 15 years in terms of going on to be president. I think it's an increasingly important position, and people are paying a lot more attention because those guys go on to run.
It's almost impossible to knock a vice president or a former vice president out of the nominating process because they have 4 years or 8 years to run around this country on Air Force Two and do fundraisers and basically sign up folks and what have you. And it's a tremendous advantage. They begin the process with about a 98% name identification, which obviously makes them look effective in early polls, and it's just a tremendous. Dan Quayle may be the long-term exception, but the bottom line is that it's a tremendous advantage.
On the candidate, the importance of the vice presidential candidate. We've heard there have been theories about what made the difference in '76, whether it was Gerald Ford freeing Poland or the pardon. And when you have a margin of 2 or 3 points, any one factor can be important. I believe that in 1976, a critical event in that election was the debate between Walter Mondale and Senator Dole, where Dole had a bad night, shall we say, and Fritz Mondale was very good, and a lot of people, that registered with a lot of folks in that election. Whether it made the difference, I don't know, but again, in a 3-point race, it might have.
But the interesting thing to note, and I think Dave will back this up, is that in 1976, every place we sent Bob Dole, after he came out, the Ford Dole ticket was ahead by more or had gained in the polls.
I'd like to say that if Mrs. Bush is as smart as she looks, she will double her husband's Secret Service protection. Because when I look at Marilyn Quayle, I am reminded of the Manchurian Candidate. It's a great movie to see. It's very up to date, in fact, because it talks about a woman who manages to manipulate events so that her husband, who's not the smartest guy in the world, becomes vice president. Then all of a sudden, the presidential nominee gets assassinated at just the right moment. It's a scary movie today. That was a partisan comment. We'd like to answer some questions, and we're hoping some people would come to the microphones and start going at us. Yes, on the right here.
Hey, I have a question, actually getting back to Quayle and spin. Do you believe that Quayle was actually used as a very excellent sort of spin technique to take a lot of negative attention off of Bush? Or did that sort of happen in the end, and then that's just sort of the way the Bush people actually used the whole issue?
David?
I haven't the foggiest idea why he picked Dan Quayle.
I think the cleverest move of the campaign so far was the carefully orchestrated decision to unleash Dan Quayle a few weeks ago, to free him of his handlers. I mean, if the handlers ever made a smooth move, that was it.
The only thing that I will say about Dan Quayle is an injustice was done to the man the way he was picked. If you would have picked Dan Quayle, if the decision was to make Dan Quayle, you don't do it in the environment of a convention. And for whatever reason, no matter how early a nominee gets this thing wrapped up, we screw up the vice presidential process. Everyone that I've been involved with, and I've been in meetings with others who've been involved in earlier candidates going back all the way to '68 with Nixon, we wait till the eve of that convention to make the choice, and we're always trying to make a big show out of the convention. The bottom line is people who want to watch a convention are going to watch it, and that's Democrat partisans and Republican partisans and very few others, and particularly now they have other options. But we always try and make a big show. If Dan Quayle would have been picked a week in advance, and you had Bob Dole and Jack Kemp standing up there saying what a wonderful choice he is, he's a good conservative, I think he's fantastic. You had 8 or 10 senators standing out there saying he's been a tremendous individual, and you didn't have 13,000 press people sitting in an environment with nothing else to do. They would all have gone and taken a look at Dan Quayle, and they would have basically maybe not liked him, maybe found everything that they found not to their satisfaction. But the bottom line is by Monday of that convention, it would have been an old story. And then Quayle could have gone on and done what most vice presidents do, which is be forgotten until Inauguration Day.
Thank you. Yeah. Next.
Let's project ahead to the day after the election. Bush has won by, very substantial majority, yet he doesn't have coattails. There's still a Democratic majority in the House and Senate. All those people have been elected in their own right, obviously. What's Bush's mandate, and what's he going to do? How's he going to define his mandate?
His mandate is to be president, and he'll damn well do a good job at it.
Well, what does that mean exactly after this campaign?
I think what it means is...
Can I address this I was interested in hearing David and Ed, who were with President Reagan in 1980, and one of you in 1984. When in 84 he had a similar kind of situation where he won big and yet really didn't carry the Congress.
Well, I don't think that Mr. Bush is going to be able to carry the Congress. The Senate might get a little bit closer. My greatest fear is that George Bush, who I think is going to have a tremendous victory, I think he can have a victory of an Eisenhower landslide proportion. But already the media and others are starting to say this was an agendaless campaign. And just as in 1984, when Ronald Reagan won 59% of the vote in 49 states, there was no mandate. The mandate was given up the day after the election, and then you sort of get back to business as usual. My fear this time is there's a resentment building among Democrats, a resentment unlike 1984 when most Democrats didn't think they had a snowball's chance in hell of winning. But there's a resentment this time because they know they could have won or think they could have won, and all the animosity is going towards Dukakis. So my sense is for about a week after the election of George Bush, they're going to say, hey, he was on the right side of the Pledge of Allegiance and Mike Dukakis lost this thing. We still control the Senate. We still control the House. And we have to define ourselves as a national party. And obviously we don't have the spokesman at the top to do that. So let's do it as a Congress. Let's do it. Here's our agenda. He doesn't have an agenda. And the other added problem that Bush has is he's not feared like Reagan was. From 1981 through about 1986, we ran the greatest bluff in American politics, in which if you didn't vote with us, Southern Democrats, we were going to go into your district where we got 80% of the vote and we're going to beat you. I ran the operation, and we never beat anybody, but we scared the hell out of a lot of people. Now, obviously, the Democrats know that's not going to work, and they're not afraid of George Bush. So my sense is that unless Bush takes the transition period and lays out a 100-day agenda and has a media plan for that 70 days of transition, not wait till he gets inaugurated and saying this is what we're going to do and here's what we're going to do and here's what we're going to do, so that there is some excitement and his agenda starts getting out there in the focus, it's going to be real tough.
Yeah,
Yes,
I
upstairs.
want to follow up a little more on this if I could. I have a great deal of concern that it's going to be much tougher for George Bush to govern than it was to win this election. Historically, as you know, a party that's been in power for 2 terms, the 3rd term tends to be a winding down and a difficult term for that party. We're coming into a transition that I don't think any of us really appreciate, and that is, as you know better than anyone else, this is the first time in 60 years we've had an end party replaced by presidency from the same party. And I think it presents the problem for the candidate that he's not going to have that traditional renewal that comes from the public, and the sense that here's a new person and this person is going to bring us a lot of good things, And there's a, we tend to deify our presidents just after they're elected during that transition period, and Bush is not going to have the benefit of that. So I think he's got to do some things, just as Ed does. I think he's got, just as Ed just suggested, I think he's got to do some things during the transition that would go beyond what a normal new president would do. I think he ought to seek rapprochement with the Democrats very swiftly. He ought to give the country some sense of a healing process very quickly, so that the people feel that he is not simply a partisan, but is going to be a leader of everyone, particularly because he's going to be probably a very low voter turnout. I think he needs to move with the allies quickly, within a matter of a few weeks, to assure them that he is, after the campaign is over, that in fact he's serious about the deficits and that they ought to continue propping up the dollar. I think that's going to be a very important part of what he does during that period. And then I think he's got to have a plan whereby he lays out a clear vision of where he plans to go as president. And he's got to either do that during the transition, or he's got to do it very quickly after he becomes president. Because I think otherwise it could be very rough sledding. The honeymoon's going to be quite different because of the difference in transitions. The press is not in a mood to grant him a honeymoon. He's going to have some significant questions about personnel. How do you revitalize an administration when an awful lot of people at the sub-cabinet level want to hang on? How do you get them out of there easily without bitterness? That's not an easy question to answer. As you
presidential appointee, Senate confirmable right now, which is remarkable.
That's right. And there are an enormous number of people in those jobs who want to stay.
Right.
And and a lot of people on the Bush side say, hey, this has got to be a new administration. This is a Bush administration. This is not a third Reagan term. And how you manage that problem, I think, is one that already occupies the minds of a lot of people on the Bush side.
Let's take one or two more, real fast, please.
Thank you. Although this discussion has been very interesting, but I'd like to ask, where are the values in this discussion? In that, here like elsewhere, we hear where have the Democrats gone wrong, and why isn't it instead, what can we do as leaders to make the election process actually better?
Well, the trouble is that you've asked a values question in basically a seminar on management of campaigns and how they're run. I think I'd love to talk about values, but I think one of the answers is to try to be more true to your own philosophy, or else discard it for the Democrats. Either get rid of it or fight for it. And it's as simple as that. If you have to keep hiding it every 4 years, sooner or later the people are going to catch on that it ain't your favorite subject to talk about. So I think you either become a liberal, love it, use the label, or get rid of the label and get rid of the philosophy, or do something. But you've got to pull it together in some reconcilable unity where this is who I am, this is how I call myself, this is my name, this is my nickname, this is my label. I think that's part of it. Certainly the Democrats have to do that. The Republicans have redefined what conservative means very effectively. Conservative used to mean no. A conservative is a guy who said no. He's Bob Taft. Now a conservative is a guy who says, here's your tax cut, here's something for you, Joe Lunchbucket, here's something for your crowd. That was a whole new thing. And they redefined themselves. The Democrats have got to be just as effective at offering something real to the same voter that decides every election. That's my answer. Les?
Yeah, but I go back to the point I made. That cannot be simply a collection of protests and causes. It's got to be much more than that. And we haven't figured out how to weave that together.
One more, please.
Worth the wait. I, and I suspect Bill Clinton, hope that the answer to my question will be something other than what Mr. Mastrangelo suggested about the governor, the potential for a governor to win as the nominee of the Democrats. I'm wondering what, if any effect the fact that Governor Dukakis is the product of a state with only one viable political party, the Democratic Party, has had on his failure to really do better when faced with a truly strong Republican opposition. It's something that I thought which is critical to the whole development of his campaign after the convention.
That's an excellent point. I'm sorry, Kathy. My sense of what's happened in other states, and we have about 49 states today where it really is competitive at the statewide level. I mean, and we have a lot of switch voters. We had 11 elections in 1986 where a Republican or a Democrat got elected governor and the opposite party got elected to the Senate. So there really is competition across this country. This state is, you've got 10 congressional districts, 10 or 11, I forget which is the last. 11. You got one Republican. He's it. I mean, it's probably going to be a long time again before you get a Republican senator or Republican governor. At least 2 years. And my sense is that a lot of beating up is going on with the Dukakis people. They are some very good people and some very able people, and I think the bottom line is that they know this state very, very well. They don't know the rest of the country very, very well. And what you need to do and why you need to bring in groups is every state is different, and you really need people who understand the nuances of those states, and that's why when you go together in a big campaign, you've got to bring it all together. And I think what happened here is this got to be a very isolated campaign. The last two presidents have been governors, so I don't think it's any handicap to be a governor. The American public can see a governor moving up to being a president, almost better than seeing a senator, obviously better than seeing a congressman moving up to be a president.
I'd just like to comment on it because I think that Ronald Reagan was able to make it from governor to president because, one, he happens to represent the largest state, and two, he had been through a national campaign, so he had begun to develop some of the feeling that I think is absolutely necessary. I don't limit my thought that it's difficult to go from governor to president just to the Democratic Party. I think a Republican governor of just an average state who doesn't have that kind of national network or that national feel would have just as much difficulty. That's the way I feel on it.
I want to say that very recently in our history we had a candidate for the Democratic nomination for president who was excellent at winning Republican votes, Ed Muskie. He won in a state which was historically Republican and would have won forever if he chose not to go to the Secretary of State job. The fact is that he couldn't win the primaries because he wasn't far left enough. He couldn't be tough enough on the war and ending the war. Now the problem is the Democrats do have a lot of people that are very good at winning bipartisan elections, winning in states like Oklahoma over and over again, David Boren. We have a lot of people that can win bipartisan contests. The trick is for them to survive the primaries and to be moderate enough or liberal enough to win the primaries and moderate enough to win the general. We've had people who've been rejected. So we have people in the Democratic Party who are superb at getting Republicans to vote for them. I just want to end tonight because it is late and it's a weekday night. And I just want to say that say something very patriotic about the election to the woman who asked about values. And I want to tell you a funny story which has a value in it, which is a apocryphal story, but they're the best kind. It's about Senator Bradley, and Senator Bill Bradley of New Jersey once went to a public function, and he was waiting to be introduced at the head table, and the waiter came by and gave him one pat of butter, and the senator said very nonchalantly, "I'll have two, please." And the waiter looked back at him and said, "Sorry, one to a customer." And Senator Bradley said, "Excuse me, I don't think you know who I am." And the waiter says, "I don't. Who are you?" He said, "I'm Bill Bradley. I went to Princeton. I was All-American 3 years. I was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University. I played for the NBA for 10 years. I was on the All-Star team for 6 years. I'm now the United States Senator from New Jersey." And the waiter turned back and said, "Excuse me, I don't think you know who I am." And the senator said, "Well, actually, I don't. Who are you?" And he said, "I'm the guy in charge of the butter." And here's the message. Come November 8th, you're in charge of the butter. You get to decide who to vote for regardless of everything we've said. Thank you and good night.